Hana Gerald adjusted the lapel of his tuxedo. It was a steady, deliberate movement, a fraction of an inch to the right, her fingers certain and calm as if she had every right in the world to be standing at the altar of Seoul's most ancient cathedral, marrying the man the world called a monster. Like there weren't 24 men in sharp charcoal suits watching her every breath from the pews. Like the most feared syndicate boss in South Korea wasn't staring down at her with an expression of raw, unshielded vulnerability. A look Lee Min-Jae had never allowed another living soul to see. She smoothed the silk one final time, looked up into his unreadable eyes. Her voice was a quiet breath, buried beneath the weight of the organ music. The federal task force is at the perimeter. They've breached the north gate. Don't use the main exit. She held his gaze for one full heavy second, the cold resolve of the detective she was supposed to be warring with the woman she was becoming. You look good in black, by the way. 48 hours earlier, Hana Gerald had been a tool in a box. Just an elite deep-cover operative sitting in a sterile interrogation room at the National Police Agency, staring at a case file that had consumed 3 years of her life. Bitter coffee, blue-tinted fluorescent lights, and the heavy silence of a woman who had forgotten what her own name sounded like when it wasn't an alias. 6 months in this operation. One final, desperate move to end a war that had left too many bodies in the Han River. Hana had been reading Lee Min-Jae the way a priest reads scripture, searching for the sin but finding only the man. Cataloging his scars. Reading his silences out of pure survival instinct, the way her academy instructor told her would either save her life or destroy her soul one day. Her instructor had not been wrong. She had noticed the tell the moment she walked into his inner sanctum. Not because he looked like a criminal. He didn't. He looked like a king managing a crumbling empire. But his jaw would tighten only when his own captain spoke of collateral damage, a microscopic twitch of disgust that had nothing to do with greed and everything to do with a man struggling against the very darkness he commanded. She had closed the case file. She had stepped into the white lace of a bride. And before the weight of the badge could pull her back, she was already walking down the aisle. Now she was here, standing in the beautiful, terrible wreckage of her mission, staring into the face of her enemy, and realizing that she might just have to burn the whole world down to keep him alive. The air in the basement briefing room was thick with the scent of ozone and old paper, a space where light went to die and truth was often buried. Hana sat in a metal chair that felt like ice against her spine, her eyes fixed on the man standing before the flickering projector. Behind him, grainy surveillance photos of Lee Min-Jae illuminated the dark, images of a man who moved through Seoul like he owned the shadows. A king in a kingdom of concrete and blood. The commissioner didn't look at her. He looked at the images of the empire he wanted to topple. He spoke of the bride operation, not as a mission but as a sacrifice. They needed someone who could disappear into a role so completely that even the mirrors wouldn't recognize her. They needed a weapon that didn't look like one. They chose Hana because her record was a long list of impossible victories, and because she had a way of looking through people until she found the one thing they were afraid to lose. He tossed a thick folder onto the table, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the cramped room. It was her life rewritten. Every memory she owned was to be replaced with a carefully constructed lie. She was no longer a detective with a badge and a brother to protect. She was to be the daughter of a disgraced tycoon, a strategic piece on a chessboard designed to lure Min-Jae into the light. He doesn't trust anyone, the commissioner said, his voice steady and dry. He has spent 15 years building walls that no SWAT team can breach. You won't be going over those walls, Hana. You'll be invited through the front door. Hana looked at the photo of Min-Jae. He was standing alone at a window, his back to the camera, his shoulders set with a weight that looked familiar even then. She felt a strange pull in her chest, a recognition of a soul that had been in the dark for too long. What if he sees through it? She asked, her voice calm despite the storm beginning to gather in her mind. The commissioner finally turned to face her, his eyes cold and devoid of comfort. Then you'll be a footnote in a report no one will ever read. This isn't about justice anymore, Agent Gerald. It's about the win. Do what you have to do. Marry the man. Break the empire. Bring him down from the inside out. Hana picked up the folder. She felt the weight of the paper, the weight of the lie, and the weight of the man she was about to destroy. She walked out of the room and into the rain, leaving Hana Gerald behind in the basement, stepping into the skin of a bride who was destined to become a widow. The mansion in Songbukdong was a monument to silence. A fortress of cold stone and glass that seemed to hold its breath as the moon climbed over the city. It was a place where walls were built not just to keep the world out, but to keep the truth buried deep within the foundation. Hana stood in the center of the master suite, the heavy silk of her wedding gown replaced by a robe that felt like a shroud. From behind the closed door of the bathroom, the steady sound of falling water signaled her window of opportunity. A few minutes to be the detective before she had to return to being the bride. She moved through the corridor with a calm that had been forged in the dark, her feet finding the path to his private study by instinct. The door to his inner sanctum opened without a sound, revealing a room that smelled of old books and expensive tobacco. It was the nerve center of an empire, a space where lives were signed away and destinies were dictated with the stroke of a pen. Hana did not look for ledgers or bank statements. Those were too obvious for a man like Lee Min-Jae. Instead, she moved toward the heavy mahogany desk that sat before the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the garden. Her fingers, steady and certain, moved over the surface until they found a hidden latch beneath the desk's edge. The drawer slid open, but it didn't contain a weapon or a ledger of bribes. Inside lay a single weathered photograph. Hana picked it up, her heart finding a rhythm that had nothing to do with the mission. It was a picture of a young Min-Jae, standing in a field of tall grass with a woman whose smile was the only light in the frame. He wasn't the king of Seoul in this image. He was just a boy, his hand resting on her shoulder with a protective warmth that looked entirely human. She looked at the set of his shoulders in the old photo, recognizing the same weight he carried today, a burden he had been bearing alone for a very long time. This was the man behind the armor, the person the National Police Agency had never bothered to document. She wasn't looking at a case file anymore. She was looking at a soul that had been forced to become a shield. The sound of the water stopped. Hana replaced the photo and closed the drawer with the same unhurried movement she had used to adjust his tie at the altar. She slipped back into the hallway, her mind a storm of conflicting loyalties. She had come here to dismantle a network, but as she stepped back into the bedroom she realized she was beginning to see the man instead of the target. The mission was still the goal, but the man was no longer just an assignment. He was a person, and in this house of secrets, that was the most dangerous discovery of all. Morning arrived not with the warmth of a new beginning, but with the clinical efficiency of a kingdom returning to order. The dining hall of the mansion was a cavern of polished marble and heavy shadows, where the light of the rising sun struggled to penetrate the thick reinforced glass. Hana sat at the long obsidian table, the silence of the room so absolute it felt like a physical weight. Every clink of her silver spoon against the porcelain bowl sounded like a tectonic shift, a reminder that in this house, even the most mundane act was performed under the gaze of a man who missed nothing. Lee Min-Jae sat at the head of the table, his attention seemingly buried in a stack of briefing folders. He hadn't looked at her since she entered the room, yet Hana could feel his awareness of her presence as clearly as a heat source in a cold room. He moved with a controlled, unhurried grace, his focus absolute as he turned a page. The kitchen staff set the table for two out of a new, uncertain ritual, their movements hushed and economical. "The East Wing is yours to manage," Min-Jae said, his voice steady and low, built for the kind of obedience that didn't require a second command. He didn't look up from his documents. "But the study and the sublevels are off-limits. There are doors in this house that lead to truths you aren't ready to carry." Hana reached for her coffee, her hand steady, maintaining the mask of the tycoon's daughter she had been trained to wear. "Every house has its secrets, Min-Jae. I didn't come here expecting a life of transparency." He finally looked up, his eyes meeting hers with a weight that made the air in the room feel thin. It wasn't the look of a suspicious criminal. It was the look of a man who could see the architecture of a person's soul. "You spent 4 minutes in my study last night," he said, his tone devoid of accusation, yet heavy with a terrifying level of observation. "You didn't move the files. You didn't touch the safe. You looked at a photograph and you sat in the dark." Hana felt a cold shock move through her chest, a realization that her academy trainers had underestimated the depth of his perception. He hadn't been in the room, yet he knew the exact duration of her stay and the focus of her attention. "I was looking for the man I married," Hana replied, her voice remaining absolutely calm, a tool of her own design. "I found him in a field of grass." He looked like he knew how to smile. Min-Jae studied her for a long, heavy moment, the corner of his mouth moving in a way that suggested a private, unshared thought. That man died a long time ago, Hana. Don't go looking for him again. It's a waste of the time we have left. He stood and adjusted his own tie, the movement a mirror of her gesture at the altar. He walked away without another word, leaving her alone in the cold light of the dining hall. Hana looked at her coffee, realizing that the mission wasn't just a battle of secrets. It was a war of observation, and she was facing an opponent who saw everything she was trying so hard to hide. The shipyard was a graveyard of rusted steel and salt air, a place where the logic of the city died and the law of the sea took over. Hana stood in the shadow of a towering shipping container, the moonlight reflecting off the oily surface of the Incheon harbor like a dull blade. This was the moment the National Police Agency had been waiting for. A massive narcotics shipment moving through the dark, a chance to cut the legs out from under the Lee syndicate. She had sent the coordinates 2 hours ago, a coded pulse sent from the heart of Min-Jae's mansion, and now the air was thick with the silent weight of an approaching storm. Min-Jae stood at the edge of the pier, his long coat snapping in the wind, a king overseeing a transaction that would fuel his empire for another year. He wasn't looking at the cargo. He was looking at the horizon, his shoulders set with that same unyielding burden she had seen in the photograph. Hana moved closer to him, her role as the supportive bride masking the reality of the traitor standing in his shadow. The raid didn't happen with a warning. It happened with a scream of sirens and the blinding flash of tactical lights. The police breached the perimeter not with the intent to arrest, but with the intent to terminate. It was a setup, the kind of violent escalation that suggested someone in her own department wanted a high-profile body count more than a trial. Lead began to tear through the air, hitting the steel containers with a sound like hammer blows. In the chaos, Min-Jae didn't run. He turned to pull Hana toward cover, his primary instinct being her safety even as his world came apart. But a sniper's beam found the center of his chest, a steady red dot appearing on the black silk of his coat. The shooter wasn't aiming for the cargo. They were aiming for the man. Hana didn't think, she moved. She dropped her weight and drove her shoulder into Min-Jae's side, throwing him behind a stack of industrial crates just as a round shattered the concrete where he had been standing. She didn't look like a tycoon's daughter as she pulled a concealed weapon from her own thigh holster, her movements certain and calm, a weapon returning to its natural state. "Stay down," she commanded, her voice cutting through the noise of the gunfire with an authority that stopped Min-Jae in his tracks. She returned fire, her focus absolute as she suppressed the high ground position. She wasn't fighting for the mission anymore. She was fighting for the man who had looked at her with unshielded vulnerability at the altar. When the smoke cleared and the police sirens began to fade into a tactical retreat, Min-Jae stood up, his gaze fixed on her with a weight she couldn't categorize. He didn't ask about the gun or her training. He simply reached out and adjusted her hair, his hands steady. "You saved me," he said, the words heavy and honest. Hana looked at the badge she carried in her mind and the man standing in the wreckage, realizing that by saving his life, she had officially declared war on her own. The library was a sanctuary of ancient wood and leather, a place where the clamor of the empire was muffled by the weight of 10,000 stories. It was a room built to endure, a fortress of knowledge where the shadows were long and the air tasted of dust and forgotten dreams. Hana stood by the towering shelves, her hand resting on the spine of a volume she had seen Min-Jae reading in the quiet hours after midnight. The house was still, the tension of the shipyard raid lingering in the corridors like a heavy fog that refused to lift. Min-Jae was there, seated in a high-backed chair by the hearth, the firelight casting a steady glow over a face that looked entirely unarmored in the solitude. He didn't have his coat on. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing the scars of a life lived in the service of a crown he had never asked to wear. He wasn't the strategist or the king in this moment. He was a man seeking refuge from the very world he commanded. "My father believed that a library was the only place where a man could be truly honest," Min-Jae said, his voice a calm, steady anchor in the silence. He didn't look up from the book in his lap. He spent his life building a kingdom of stone and blood, but he died wishing he had spent more time among these pages. Hana moved toward him, her footsteps silent on the heavy rug. "And you, Min-Jae? What do you wish for?" He finally looked at her, and for a second, the mask of the syndicate boss was gone, replaced by a weary honesty that made Hana's heart tighten. "I wish I had been given a choice," he said, the words heavy with the truth of a man who had been a prisoner since the day he was born. I inherited a war I didn't start. I carry the weight of 5,000 families who look to me for their survival. To walk away is to leave them to the wolves. Hana reached out, her fingers brushing the edge of the table near his hand. She saw the architectural blueprints of his life. A structure built not of choice but of obligation. He wasn't a monster by nature. He was a man who had become a shield because the alternative was extinction. She realized then that the National Police Agency wasn't just trying to arrest a criminal. They were trying to dismantle a man who was the only thing standing between order and absolute chaos. You carry it well, Hana whispered, her voice devoid of the clinical detachment of a detective. Min-Jae reached up and adjusted his glasses, a small human movement that felt more intimate than a kiss. I carry it because I have to, Hana. But sometimes I wonder what it would be like to look at a window and not see a target. He looked back at his book, the silence returning to the library, but it was no longer the silence of secrets. It was the silence of two souls who had finally seen each other without the armor. Hana stood beside him, the mission to destroy his empire feeling like a betrayal of the man who had never wanted it to begin with. The fire burned low, but the warmth between them remained, a dangerous light in a house built for the dark. The city at midnight was a sprawling grid of neon and shadow, a labyrinth where the cold rain washed the streets but never the sins beneath them. Hana stood in the hollowed-out shell of an abandoned subway station, the air heavy with the scent of damp concrete and the distant, steady beat of the city's heart. This was the edge of her two worlds, a place where the light of the mansion met the darkness of the law. She waited in the gloom, her posture set with the quiet resolve of a woman who had learned to live in the spaces between the truth. The commissioner emerged from the dark, his footsteps echoing with a finality that made the station feel like a tomb. He didn't offer a greeting, he offered a demand for progress. To him, the mansion in Songbukdong was just a target, and Min-Jae was just a name on a warrant that needed to be signed in blood. He looked at Hana with eyes that saw only the mission, oblivious to the fact that the woman standing before him was no longer the weapon he had sent into the fire. The shipyard raid was a mess, the commissioner said, his voice a dry, level blade that cut through the silence. But it proved one thing, he's vulnerable. We need the encryption keys for his financial network. We need the names of the captains who manage the American routes. How much have you pulled? Hana felt the weight of the card Min-Jae had given her. The address, the phone number, the silent invitation into his life. She thought of the library, the firelight, and the man who had looked at her and admitted he was terrified of the world he had inherited. For months she had been a tool of absolute rationality, but in this moment the architecture of her loyalty shifted. Nothing he hasn't already scrubbed, Hana said, the lie moving from her lips with a steady, unhurried calm. It was the moment she stepped away from the badge and toward the man. He's more observant than we anticipated. He keeps the primary ledgers in a sublevel I haven't breached. If I move too fast, the whole operation collapses. The commissioner studied her, his gaze heavy and clinical. Don't let the luxury soften your edge, Agent Gerald. Remember why you're there. You aren't his protector, you're his executioner. Every day you fail to deliver is a day he continues to breathe. I know my role, Hana replied, her voice a steady anchor in the dark. She watched him retreat into the shadows, leaving her alone in the cold station. She had come here to give a report, but she was leaving with a secret that would cost her everything. She wasn't just a detective anymore. She was a variable that the department hadn't planned for. As she walked back toward the surface, she realized that the most dangerous lie wasn't the one she told the commissioner. It was the one she was beginning to believe herself. The grand ballroom was a sea of shimmering silk and cold gold, a theater of high society masks where every smile was a strategic move and every glass of champagne was a potential weapon. Hana stood at Min-Jae's side, her gown a flow of deep emerald that hid the tactical weight of the small blade strapped to her thigh. The air was heavy with the scent of expensive perfume and the steady rhythmic pulse of a string quartet that seemed to be counting down to a moment no one else in the room could see. This was the territory of the elite, where power was measured in the depth of a bow and the length of a silence. Lee Min-Jae moved through the crowd with a calm, unhurried presence, the king of a domain that was currently being circled by wolves. He handled the pleasantries with a practiced, level grace, but Hana could feel the alert tension in his arm beneath her hand. They were here to meet Han Byung-chul, a man whose name was a synonym for surgical destruction. Byung-chul stood near the center of the floor, his face a study in neutral composure, yet his eyes never fully rested on the man he was supposed to be honoring. Hana watched the room out of pure habit, the way she had been trained since the academy. She wasn't looking at the faces, she was looking at the hands. She noticed the rival boss's tell, the moment he stepped toward the podium to offer the evening's toast. It wasn't an obvious movement, but his right hand kept drifting toward his left side every 30 seconds, hovering near his jacket before returning to his hip, a tell of someone managing something enormous happening inside them. He wasn't reaching for a speech, he was settling a weight. "The wine is a distraction," Hana whispered, her voice a quiet breath against Min-Jae's ear as the rival raised a crystal flute to the light. She didn't wait for him to react. As the rival boss began to speak of eternal alliances, Hana stepped forward with the same certain calm movement she had used to adjust Min-Jae's tie in the lobby. She stumbled into the waiter carrying the tray intended for the head table, the crash of glass shattering the calculated piece of the ballroom. In the second of absolute silence that followed, she saw the rival's jaw tighten, his hand committing to the movement beneath his coat. Hana's hand was already moving. She didn't draw her blade, she grabbed Min-Jae's arm and pivoted, using his own momentum to pull him behind the heavy marble pillar just as the first suppressed round tore through the silk wallpaper where his head had been. The ballroom erupted into chaos, but Hana remained upright and composed, her back against the stone, breathing hard but focused. Min-Jae looked at her, the recognition of a pattern finally fully arriving in his eyes. She had saved him before she knew who he was, and she was doing it again now that she did. The mansion was a vault of heavy stone and absolute stillness, a place where the echoes of the ballroom's violence were left at the gates. The air in the private quarters was thick with the scent of antiseptic and the steady rhythmic beat of a city that continued to move beyond the walls, indifferent to the blood spilled in its name. Hana sat on the edge of the velvet chaise, her emerald gown torn at the shoulder where a shard of glass had found its mark during the chaos. The wound was small, a shallow reminder of the cost of her intervention, but in the silence of the room, it felt like a monumental fracture in her armor. Min-Jae moved toward her with a calm, unhurried presence, his tuxedo jacket discarded and his sleeves rolled up to reveal the steady hands of a man who had learned to mend what the world tried to break. He didn't call for the staff, he didn't delegate the task to a professional. He sat down across from her, his movements certain and deliberate as he opened a small kit. The distance between them vanished, replaced by an atmosphere so heavy with unsaid truths it made the oxygen in the room feel thin. His fingers were cool and steady as he cleaned the cut, his focus absolute. Every touch was a silent conversation, a mirror of the unhurried way she had once adjusted his tie in a hotel lobby. Hana watched him, her habit of cataloging faces and reading the room failing her as she looked at the man instead of the target. The undercover mission, the files, the reports, the hidden badge, felt like a pale hollow lie compared to the weight of his presence. "You should have let me handle it," Min-Jae said, his voice a quiet anchor in the stillness. He didn't look up, but his hand lingered for a second longer than necessary against her skin. "You weren't supposed to be part of the wreckage." "I go where I'm needed," Hana replied, her voice steady despite the way her heart was doing something she had not given it permission to do. He reached up slowly and tucked a lock of hair back from her face, his eyes finally meeting hers with an unshielded honesty that stripped away every layer of her defense. In this house of secrets, the physical proximity was the most dangerous variable of all. She was a detective sent to dismantle an empire, but as he leaned in to check the dressing, she realized the person she was most likely to destroy was herself. The mission was a distant echo, the man was the only thing that was real. The basement of the mansion was a vault of cold concrete and weeping pipes, a place where the air was thick with the scent of wet stone and the heavy metallic taste of impending finality. It was the foundation of an empire, where the silence was not a gift but a warning, and the only light came from a single unblinking bulb that swayed with the rhythm of the city's distant pulse. Hana stood in the shadows, her posture set with a forced, level calm, watching as the world she had infiltrated prepared to purge itself. Min-Jae stood in the center of the room, his long coat discarded, his presence a steady, unhurried anchor in the middle of the storm. He didn't look like a man in a fury. He looked like a judge delivering a verdict that had already been written in the stars. Before him knelt a soldier, a man who had served the Lee syndicate for a decade with a loyalty that had never before been questioned. But the leaks from the shipyard and the gala had created a pattern that Min-Jae had analyzed with the clinical focus of a mathematician. He knew there was a mole, and in this world, a suspicion was the same as a conviction. "I trusted you with the keys to the harbor," Min-Jae said, his voice a quiet, steady blade that cut through the sound of the dripping water. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. And yet, every move I make is met with a tactical response. There is a leak in my house, and it is threatening the only thing I have left to protect. He looked back at Hana, his eyes meeting hers for a second with a weight that made the oxygen in the room feel thin. It was a look of absolute, unshielded devotion. He wasn't doing this to save his shipments. He was doing it to secure the perimeter around her. He was executing a loyal man to protect the woman who was actually destroying him. Hana felt the weight of the badge in her mind, a cold and heavy ghost of the person she used to be. She wanted to speak, to stop the unhurried movement of Min-Jae's hand as he reached for the weapon on the table, but the mission held her tongue. To save the soldier was to reveal the traitor. She stood upright and composed, her fingers certain and calm at her sides, while the architecture of her soul began to collapse. The sound of the shot was a single, final punctuation mark in the silence of the basement. Min-Jae didn't look at the fallen man. He walked toward Hana, his movements deliberate and unhurried, and adjusted the collar of her coat with the same gentle touch he had used in the library. "It's over," he said, his voice a steady anchor. "You're safe now." Hana looked into his eyes, seeing the truth of a man who would burn his own kingdom to keep her standing, and realized that the rat hunt was a success. The only problem was that the rat was still standing in his arms, and the man she was sent to destroy was the only one willing to die for her. The moon hung over the Songbukdong estate like a cold, silver coin, casting long shadows across the stone floors of the master study. The air inside was still and heavy with the scent of old wood and the lingering weight of a kingdom that had been held together by sheer force of will. Hana stood by the expansive window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance, a sprawling grid of millions of stories that she was supposed to protect. Behind her, the door opened with an unhurried click and the atmosphere in the room shifted, settling into a quiet, intense focus that only one man could command. Min-Jae moved into the light of the desk lamp, his presence a steady anchor in the darkness. He didn't look like a man who had just purged his inner circle. He looked like a man who had finally decided to stop fighting the inevitable. He held a small obsidian drive in his hand, a tiny object that contained the blueprints of his entire empire, the bank accounts, the encrypted routes, and the names of every shadow operative on his payroll. "My father told me that trust is the only thing more expensive than blood," Min-Jae said, his voice a calm, level melody in the silence. He walked toward her, his movements certain and deliberate, and placed the drive into her palm. His fingers lingered against hers, a touch that was unhurried and entirely unarmored. "Consider this a wedding gift. It is the architecture of everything I have built. I am putting it in your hands because I no longer wish to carry it alone." Hana felt the weight of the drive as if it were a mountain. This was the mission. The total access she had been sent to secure, the evidence that would dismantle the Lee syndicate and send Min-Jae to a cell for the rest of his life. It was the victory the National Police Agency had demanded, delivered to her not through tactical brilliance, but through the absolute unshielded faith of the man she was supposed to destroy. "You're giving me everything," Hana whispered, her voice steady despite the storm of guilt rising in her chest. Min-Jae reached up and adjusted her hair with a slow, gentle movement, his eyes meeting hers with a devotion that made the badge in her mind feel like a heavy, cold shackle. "I am giving you the truth, Hana. For 15 years I have lived in a house of mirrors, waiting for someone to see me without the armor. You adjusted my tie in that lobby and told me to pay attention." He paused, his gaze never wavering. "I'm paying attention now." He turned and walked toward the door, leaving her alone with the keys to his kingdom and the crushing realization that she had successfully built a bridge to a man just in time to watch her department burn it down. The mission was complete, but as Hana looked at the drive in her hand, she realized the cost was not his empire, it was her soul. The storm over Seoul arrived with a heavy, deliberate finality, the sky a bruised curtain of iron and rain that seemed to descend upon the city like a judgment. The air in the abandoned industrial terminal was thick with the scent of wet metal and the steady rhythmic beat of tactical boots moving in the dark. Hana stood in the shadows of the command center, her posture set with the level calm of a weapon that had been tuned for a single final strike. This was the conclusion of the Bride operation, the moment when the architecture of the Lee syndicate was supposed to collapse under the weight of the law. The captain moved into the blue light of the monitors, his presence a cold, unhurried anchor in the middle of the tactical preparations. He didn't look like a man seeking justice. He looked like a strategist overseeing the final removal of a variable. He checked his sidearm with a steady, certain movement, his focus absolute as he reviewed the kill zones. Hana watched him, her habit of reading the room and cataloging faces finding a fracture in his composure. A small, microscopic twitch of his jaw that had nothing to do with the mission and everything to do with a man managing a secret. The breach happens at 0300, the captain said, his voice a dry, level blade in the silence. We don't wait for a surrender. The objective is to terminate the threat before the assets can be moved. Hana felt the weight of the encrypted drive in her pocket, the wedding gift that contained the names of every shadow operative in Min-Jae's world. She moved toward the terminal, her fingers certain and calm as she accessed the internal comms to confirm the tactical routes. But as the data unrolled across the screen, the truth surfaced with a cold and immediate clarity. The transfers didn't lead to Min-Jae's captains. They led back to her own department. The final raid wasn't a mission to dismantle the Mafia. It was a setup to erase the evidence and ensure Min-Jae never made it to a courtroom. Her own captain was on the payroll, a man who had spent 15 years building a career on the blood of the people he was supposed to protect. The raid was designed as a surgical strike, a way to bury the syndicate's ties to the police force by making sure the King of Seoul was silenced forever. Hana stood in the center of the command room, the blue light reflecting off her unreadable eyes. She thought of the library, the firelight, and the man who had looked at her without armor and said he was terrified. She had come here to be an executioner, but she was standing in a room full of executioners, and she was the only one who knew the target was the only honest man left. She turned toward the exit, her movements unhurried and deliberate, realizing that the mission was over, and the war for Min-Jae's life had just begun. The rain over the Songbukdong mansion was a relentless, vertical assault, a heavy curtain of water that turned the city below into a blurred sea of neon and shadow. The air was thick with the scent of wet stone and the ozone of an approaching catastrophe, a silence so profound it felt like the world was holding its breath before the final fall. Hana stood on the high balcony, the cold wind whipping her hair across a face that was a study in absolute unmoving resolve. Below, in the darkness of the tree line, she could see the faint rhythmic pulse of tactical infrared lights, the shadow of the department she had served for a decade, moving in for the kill. Lee Min-Jae was inside his study, unaware that the men currently encircling his home weren't there to read him his rights, but to ensure he never spoke again. Hana felt the weight of the encrypted drive in her hand, the gift that contained the truth of the corruption reaching all the way to the commissioner's office. She looked at the dark perimeter, then back at the door to the man who had looked at her without armor and placed his entire life in her palms. The architecture of her duty was a crumbling ruin. The only thing left standing was the man who had become her greatest protector. She moved with a calm, unhurried presence, her feet silent on the marble floor as she stepped back into the warmth of the study. Min-Jae was standing at the window, his back to the room, his shoulders set with that familiar, heavy burden. He didn't turn when she entered, his focus on the rain-slicked glass. The tactical breach was 60 seconds away. The choice wasn't about justice or the law anymore. It was about the person standing at that window. Min-Jae, she said, her voice a steady, level anchor in the quiet room. He turned, his expression unshielded and calm, a man who had finally found peace in the presence of the only soul he trusted. Hana looked at him, the detective in her mind screaming that she was about to commit the ultimate betrayal of her badge. She reached out and adjusted his tie one final time, her fingers certain and calm, the gesture a mirror of every moment that had led them to this precipice. The men outside aren't here for the syndicate, she whispered, her voice a quiet blade that cut through the sound of the rain. They're here for you. And they're being led by my captain. She pulled the hidden badge from her waist and laid it on the mahogany desk between them, the metal reflecting the dim light like a cold, hard truth. I was sent here to destroy you, Min-Jae. But if you stay in this room, you won't live to see the morning. Min-Jae looked at the badge, then back at her, his eyes meeting hers with a weight that made the oxygen in the room feel thin. He didn't move toward his weapon. He didn't look for an exit. He simply stood there, the silence between them enormous and honest, as the first flashbang shattered the windows and the world outside began to pour in. The mansion was a fortress under siege, the air thick with the metallic scent of spent casings and the relentless rhythmic drumming of the storm against the stone. Light from the flickering emergency lamps cast long, unsteady shadows across the grand hallway, a space that had once been a monument to untouchable power and was now a gauntlet of shattered glass and rising smoke. Hana stood in the center of the corridor, her breathing steady and deep, her eyes fixed on the man walking toward her through the haze. Lee Min-Jae moved with an unhurried, terrifying calm, the king of a crumbling castle who refused to bow to the chaos he had inherited. He stopped 3 feet from her, his gaze landing on the small, thin wire that had snagged on the lace of her torn sleeve during the breach. It was the physical evidence of her betrayal, a cold silver thread that connected her to the very men currently systematically dismantling his life. Hana didn't move. She didn't reach for her sidearm. She stood upright and composed, her fingers certain and calm at her sides, watching the man she had come to destroy process the magnitude of the lie they had lived. Min-Jae reached out, his hand steady as he traced the path of the wire. He didn't look like a man about to deliver a sentence of death. He looked like a person whose last remaining anchor had just been cut. The silence between them was enormous, an absolute, unshielded honesty that made the distant sound of the tactical teams feel like a fading memory. "I spent 15 years waiting for a reason to trust the world," Min-Jae said, his voice a quiet, level melody that held more weight than the storm outside. He looked at the wire, then back at her, his eyes meeting hers with a devotion that remained entirely unarmored. "I find it poetic that the only person who made me feel human was the one sent to ensure I never breathed again." He didn't draw his weapon to defend himself. Instead, he unholstered the heavy, black pistol from his side and held it out to her, handle first. It was a gesture of total surrender, a wedding gift more final than the encrypted drive. He was placing the conclusion of his story in her hands, giving her the win her department demanded. "Finish it, Hana," he whispered, his voice a steady anchor in the smoke. "If the justice you serve requires a body, let it be mine. I'd rather die by your hand than live in a world where I have to go back to being the man you were sent to kill." Hana looked at the weapon, then at the man who had sat on hallway floors and remembered exactly how she took her tea. She felt the last wall of the bride operation dissolve into dust. She didn't take the gun to finish him. She took it, checked the chamber with a certain, unhurried movement, and stood at his side, facing the door as the first tactical team turned the corner. "I'm not here for the badge anymore, Min-Jae," she said, her voice a quiet blade of resolve. "And I'm not letting them take the only man in this city worth saving." The terminal was a skeletal landscape of rusted iron and shadows that refused to yield, a place where the air tasted of salt and the heavy electric scent of an impending storm. It was the edge of the world, a silent theater for a war that the city above would never acknowledge. Hana stood at the center of the loading bay, her breathing steady and deep, her eyes reflecting the cold blue flicker of the industrial lights. Beside her, Lee Min-Jae moved with an unhurried, terrifying calm, the king and the detective finally standing on the same side of the line. The masks were gone. The only thing remaining was the certain level resolve to burn the corruption out of the dark. The captain emerged from the haze of the upper catwalk, his silhouette a sharp, unforgiving blade against the gray sky. He wasn't alone. The rogue Mafia faction, the men who had traded their honor for a seat at the table of a dying empire, stood behind him with their weapons drawn. It was a union of two poisons, a partnership built on the shared belief that they were the only ones powerful enough to dictate who lived and who died. The captain looked down at Hana, his expression a study in neutral, clinical disappointment. "You had a career that people would have told stories about, Agent Gerald," the captain said, his voice a dry, level melody that cut through the sound of the rising wind. "But you chose the man over the mission. You chose the ruin over the law." "I chose the truth over a lie," Hana replied, her voice a steady anchor in the silence. She didn't look like a bride anymore. She looked like a force of nature returning to its source. She didn't wait for a signal. Hana moved laterally, a certain and calm blur as she drew the weapon Min-Jae had handed her in the hallway. At the same moment, Min-Jae transitioned into a fluid, unhurried strike, his presence a steady anchor as they dismantled the perimeter with a level of coordination that felt like destiny. They weren't fighting as two individuals. They were moving as a single, devastating architecture of retribution. The battle was not loud or dramatic. It was thorough. Hana targeted the tactical positions with a focus that left no room for error, while Min-Jae neutralized the traitors within his own ranks with a quiet, final brilliance. When they reached the upper catwalk, the captain was alone, his hand hovering near his jacket in a towel he could no longer hide. Hana stood before him, the rain beginning to fall in heavy, deliberate sheets. She didn't pull the trigger. She reached out and adjusted the captain's collar, her fingers certain and calm, the gesture a mirror of her first interaction with Min-Jae. "The evidence is already with the Bureau," she whispered, her voice a quiet blade. "The empire you built is gone. And you're just a man with nowhere left to run." She stepped back as the real authorities breached the perimeter, leaving the captain to the justice he had tried so hard to subvert. Hana turned to Min-Jae, the morning light beginning to catch the early gray of the sky, and felt the weight of the war finally begin to lift. The real enemy was dismantled, and for the first time in 3 years she could breathe. The morning over Seoul broke with a quiet, unhurried grace, the sun climbing over the Han River to reveal a city that had shifted on its axis while the world slept. The smoke from the industrial terminal had long since cleared, replaced by the crisp, clean air of a new season. The Lee Syndicate, an architecture of power that had cast a shadow over the peninsula for 15 years, was a crumbling ruin, dismantled not by a frontal assault, but by the steady, clinical application of the truth. Hana stood on the edge of the river, her coat wrapped tight against the early chill, watching the water carry the remnants of her old life toward the sea. She was no longer an undercover agent. The Bride operation was a closed file, a collection of reports that would eventually find their way to a basement archive, a story of a mission that had succeeded at the cost of the woman who led it. The commissioner was gone, the captain was in a cell, and the department was purging the poison she had helped surface. But in the wreckage of the victory, there was a hole that the law could not fill. Lee Min-Jae had vanished in the aftermath of the terminal battle, disappearing into the vast, indifferent expanse of the city he had once commanded. Hana moved through the morning crowds with a calm, level presence, her habit of cataloging faces and reading the room returning to her like a familiar, heavy weight. She sat at a small cafe table near the Grand Hyatt, her laptop closed, her coffee cooling in the light. She had built a bridge to a man, only to watch him walk across it and into the dark. She told herself it was the only way the story could end, that a king without a kingdom had no place in the world of a detective. A waiter approached her table with a steady, unhurried movement. He didn't offer a menu, he placed a single obsidian card on the marble surface. It was a mirror of the card she had received in the lobby a lifetime ago, an address in a quiet district far from the stone walls of Songbukdong. Hana picked up the card, her fingers certain and calm. On the back, written in a hand that was steady, strategic and final, were 4 words that made the oxygen in the air feel thick with a new kind of promise. "I'm paying attention now." She looked up at the city, the millions of stories unfolding simultaneously in the morning light, and felt the last wall of her defense dissolve into the warmth of the sun. She stood up, her movements deliberate and certain, and walked away from the cafe. She wasn't looking for a criminal or a case file anymore. She was looking for the man who had sat on a hallway floor because he did not know how else to stay. The doors of her old life were closed, but the door to Min-Jae was open, and for the first time in 3 years she knew exactly where she was going.